Okay, well, it is 1:04, so Crystal, I think we should go ahead and dive in if that makes sense. All right. Awesome. All right, thank you everyone for being here today. Welcome to our 9th meeting of the Building Performance Standard Task Force. It's great to see you all, and we're excited for our discussion today. So we're going to go ahead and dive right in. I believe most of you guys have heard this, but if your name and organization are not already in your Zoom name, please go ahead and make that update right now. And meeting norms for the day. We're going to run through, our typical slurry of slides at the beginning here. So as always, if you guys can keep your cameras on and mute yourselves when you're not speaking, that definitely helps us keep a smooth meeting running. We want you guys to remember there are no bad ideas in this task force. All of our ideas that are shared here today will be considered, so please speak freely. Share your thoughts and share this space with each other. Be respectful and be present. Remember that it's important to leverage your expertise and not your position or connections. And then we want to be considerate of all viewpoints, including those outside of the space. And because we are on such a short timeline to get all of these recommendations wrapped up, we added a new meeting norm. Enough, let's move on. And we may employ this meeting norm as needed to make sure that we avoid any rabbit holes that might come up and keep our task force on task for the discussion today. So what we're all here to do, a quick reminder of the goals of this task force and our timeline for finalizing our recommendations. You all are here to make sure that this building performance standard recommendations are equitable, that they promote a low carbon and clean energy economy, and that they lower energy costs and improve indoor air quality. And in addition, we're looking to form, these recommendations will inform the building performance standard that will eventually lead to building sector-wide emission reduction of 7% by 2026 and 20% by 2030. You all have developed a number of guiding goal statements, and we've included the summary in the last few meetings, but just a reminder that these were discussed, decided on, and voted on. So as we're considering today's discussion specifically around equity in workforce, please keep these guiding goal statements in mind. Our building performance standard timeline, again, this is not new news to you all, but our goal here is to have our recommendations finalized by July, where they will be shared with the CEO, Director, Governor, General Assembly, and the AQCC. And then by June of next year, the AQCC will probably, well, I'm not going to pretend like I'm going to be able to say that word today. They will make the rules and they'll go into effect sometime after June 2023. Building owners will then have 3 years to track energy use and make improvements before their first reporting deadline, or the first compliance deadline, which is June 1st, 2027. Okay, so we wanted to go over quickly what happened in meeting number 8, and then we'll discuss what happened in meeting 8A, which is the optional meeting that happened a couple weeks ago, and then we'll dive into our agenda for today. So as you guys recall, in meeting 8, we started off by discussing and voting on changes to how the task force wants to recommend crediting renewable energy in the building performance standard. Then we moved on to discussing and voting how the changes, or excuse me, to how the task force recommends crediting beneficial electrification in the building performance standard. And then finally, we discussed demand flexibility and edited some proposals that the Energy Office had come up with on how we could provide credit to buildings who integrate demand flexibility technology and programming. We did not take a vote on that, and it was merely just a discussion. And then at the end, we started discussing adjusted compliance pathways. And through meeting 8, a couple topics that we decided we needed to continue to discuss were how we incorporate alternative compliance into the BPS and how we incorporate demand response or grid flexibility into the BPS. So those topics are to come today and at a later date. Then for our optional meeting, which we are calling 8A, that meeting was really focused on honing in on our adjusted compliance proposals. So we had two core proposals that we shared with the group, one for target adjustment and one for timeline adjustment. So we discussed those, and you all had the opportunity to provide feedback on edits that you thought we should make to update those proposals. We discussed examples of when buildings would need to apply for each type of adjustment, which helped us narrow down the list of how we can identify buildings that might need these adjustment options. And then finally, we discussed how buildings should report to the Energy Office and what they should have to provide if they are going to pursue an adjusted compliance option. So far to date, again, we've made a number of really great decisions as a task force, and we still have a few remaining to decide. Under the umbrella of the decisions that we've made so far, we have our guiding goals finalized. We've decided that on our primary metric for the BPS, which is site EUI, and we decided how we would use that metric to set targets. We recommended partial credit can be applied to buildings who use renewable energy and retire the RECs. And then we decided that an 80% electrification of space and water heating loads would mean full compliance with the BPS for any building that can achieve that. Finally, we created a recommendation around partial credit for partial electrification. And as you guys recall, that vote was, and that proposal was left intentionally high level so that the AQCC could lend itself in helping this task force understand how to get partial credit for partial electrification. So looking ahead, the decisions we have yet to make in the few meetings we have left together are the principles for demand flexibility that we want to consider and how we want to incorporate that into the language for our recommendations. The adjusted compliance options for building owners that we want to pursue as part of our recommendation. And then the piece that we'll be diving into in greater detail today is recommendations on programs to support building owners and workforce to comply with the building performance standards. And then, of course, we want to make sure that the recommendations that we have come up with at the end of this process reflect equity and that we're considering equity through each one of the recommendations. So all of this lends itself to our agenda today. The two objectives for our meeting today are to finalize and vote on the proposals for adjusted compliance, and then kickstart our discussion on programs that support compliance and workforce considerations and equity considerations. And just know that we will have additional time after this meeting to continue to discuss the three items in that last bullet. And today is really going to kickstart the brainstorm and be more of an open forum to hear your guys' ideas around those three areas. So we'll start with me speaking right now, the project overview. We'll move on to discussing and finalizing the timeline adjustment option for our adjusted compliance. Then we'll move on to finalize the target adjustment option. And then we'll take a quick moment at the end of both of those to make sure that we've captured all of you all's feedback on adjusted compliance. And if you have any concerns about the two compliance options that we'll vote on and whether or not those satisfy all the needs of the building owners that will have to comply with the BPS. Then we'll take a quick break. And after the break, we will share with you all, again, this was shared as pre-work, but we've developed a visual matrix to help this task force and the public understand how all of these requirements and options for compliance work together. So we'll present that to you all and see if there's any additional thoughts you guys have on it that you'd like to share. And then we'll spend the last chunk of our meeting today diving into programs to support compliance, workforce, and equity. And then we'll wrap up. So before we dive into adjusted compliance, we wanted to give you guys just a quick overview on how this task force will be wrapping itself up. So we are at task force meeting number 9 right now, where we're talking adjusted compliance and programs for compliance, workforce, and equity. We'll have an optional meeting coming up June 8th. And the focus of that meeting, again, will be continuing our discussion on workforce equity and programs for compliance. We'll come back together at meeting 10, and our hope during meeting, but between this meeting and our optional meeting, is that we'll have several solid proposals from this group that we can present to you all at meeting 10 for how we should be considering workforce programs, equity considerations, and additional programs for compliance. We'll get a final recommendation from the task force during meeting 10 on those 3 areas. And then between June and July, we will be hosting our 3 public meetings. Those meetings dates are still TBD, and we will get you guys those meeting dates as soon as we have them. So thank you for your patience in waiting until we have our schedules mapped out for the summer to be able to put those on the calendar. Our hope is that by the time our optional meeting comes around on our last optional meeting on June 13th, that we will have had a few of our public meetings by that point to collect some feedback. And we will also have launched our public survey. And I apologize, I forgot to mention when that, how that fits into this timeline. Our goal is to get the survey launched in early June so that we can keep it open for a month. And by July 13th, we'll have received public feedback via that survey. And during the optional meeting, our goal is to discuss that public feedback and understand how we might want to incorporate the public feedback into our recommendations. Then our final meeting, which will be at the end of July, is going to be to review and confirm all final recommendations. Now, I wanted to just let you all know that sometime between Task Force Meeting 10 and Task Force Meeting 11, we will likely be reaching out to you all as pre-work to review all of the recommendations that are final, or sort of maybe in draft form, add any final comments to them that you guys would like to see, or any final considerations you want to include. And that will happen before our final meeting, so that if we just don't want to run out of time to collect all of your guys' valuable feedback if there's anything we missed through the process. So are there any questions on the schedule, how we're planning to wrap up the rest of our meetings, or on our agenda for the day? Yeah, Nori.
Sorry, couldn't find my hand. I'm just curious if we can go ahead and start our one-on-one constituent meetings before the public meetings happen. Can we start our own outreach and sharing of the PowerPoint that's going to be prepared?
Yes, and I will, sorry, so we are working right now. Our hope is to have the survey and the PowerPoint finalized at the same time. And again, we think that will be early June. So within the next 2 to 3 weeks. So as soon as that resource is ready, we will share that with the whole of the task force. And yes, you are welcome to continue, or to begin that outreach.
I'll also say that you can use any of the presentation materials on the CEO website. We share all the previous presentations and such. So if you have a one-on-one that is coming up before we have those materials ready, please feel free to use any of the presentation slides or documents we've used so far.
Great, thanks. I'm excited for the alternate compliance, and then we'll be able to do that. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Nori. Bill, I see your hand up.
Yeah, are the public meetings going to be in person or virtual?
They will be virtual on Zoom.
Okay.
Great question. Thanks, Bill. Okay. Well, I'm not hearing any other questions, but if they come up, definitely drop them in the chat. We're happy to answer them. And we will move ahead now to discussing our alternative compliance or adjusted compliance pathways. So just as a quick reminder of the background of this discussion. So the compliance adjustment options are really meant for buildings that cannot follow core compliance to achieve the BPS target. This is for buildings that demonstrate, as it says, an inability to meet the site EUI compliance target or the deadline. I want to make it really clear, we want to emphasize that adjusted compliance does not mean an exemption. the covered buildings that might receive an adjusted compliance target or an adjusted compliance timeline will still need to comply with that new target or the new timeline. So this is not to say that buildings who pursue this don't have to do anything. They will still have to demonstrate that they're meeting the intent of this building performance standard by improving the efficiency of their building. If that means they get a little bit more time to do so, or if it means they have a slightly less aggressive target to hit, they still need to be doing something. And so the options that we wanted to consider for this tried to acknowledge the diversity of building types that we have in the state. We wanted to make sure that these options were supporting equity and providing flexible options for under-resourced buildings. And then really it's about providing flexibility so that every single building in covered building that's covered by this law in the state can meet the intent of the BPS, which is to improve the efficiency of their building. We talked about the type of documentation that we would need to support an adjusted compliance pathway. And so in general, a building owner would need to submit a request to the Colorado Energy Office to request one or both of these types of adjustments. And building owners must provide documentation that they can't make their target or meet the timeline, and that they made a good faith effort to meet the intent of the BPS. So just for a little bit of background, let's first talk about today the timeline adjustment. So these were all sent out, these two compliance adjustment options were sent out to you ahead of time. So hopefully you guys had some time to review them. I'm not going to review this word for word. But what I would love to do is open up the floor and see if you guys had any thoughts or suggested changes or comments regarding the proposal here for the timeline adjustment. And before I open the floor, our plan for this, we are going to discuss as we usually do, hear everybody's thoughts, make suggested changes to these slides if necessary. And then the way that we'll be conducting the vote in this meeting is we are going to vote on the whole of this slide as the timeline adjustment or target adjustment proposal. So we will have a vote that comes up at the end of our discussion, and we will vote yes or no. Do you approve this slide as our recommendation for a timeline or target adjustment? And that will be in reference to the whole of the slide, not the individual pieces. So hopefully that makes sense. And I will now pass it off to you guys to hear your thoughts on the timeline adjustment proposal that we've written here. Bill.
I'd like to ask one question, Kimberly, and that is,
oh yeah, sure, Paul.
For a building to apply for this exemption, would it have to be one of those 5 categories that you list there? Or as you say, those are simply examples and it will be up to the owner of the building to determine whether they want to make an exemption application?
Yeah, Paul, thanks. Great question. So these bullets here are examples, and we hope we tried to write them at a high enough level that they captured most scenarios. And this is just to add that level of specificity that we had talked about at our last meeting, to try to give folks a sense of, would this apply to them or not? But any building can apply for these adjusted compliance options, even if they don't think that their building fits cleanly under one of those bullets. And then it would be up to the CEO to decide if they would allow that or not.
Right, because I could imagine a few other more limited types of projects that would have similar problems that aren't covered by these categories.
Right. Yeah, thanks, Paul. And if you think it's one that's broad enough to cover, a significant portion of the affected buildings, we're happy to think about including it. Otherwise, we did try to keep this at a high level.
The first one that comes to my mind is historic properties. And the issue of sometimes complying with historic regulations make it tough to achieve the criteria.
Okay, that's a great suggestion. Let's see, Crystal, would you like me to stop? Should we move into like a live edit mode and add a couple of these? And then if folks agree, we can keep them in?
Yeah, we can, Julia and I can duplicate this slide and you can refresh this and we can have some suggestions. I do think there's a bullet that's under the target adjustment that actually may count those historic buildings. So I think we may be able to include that one.
Great. And Bill, I see your hand up, so I will pass it to you.
Yeah, I had 3 items for timeline adjustment. I thought we should allow timeline for utility availability, utility infrastructure, because I believe electrification, especially, there could be delays in availability of service. And so if somebody's planning to electrify, we could give them a timeline adjustment for that. Also, and maybe this is sort of the same, but renewable energy availability. If solar gardens are being developed, but they're not ready yet, perhaps you could adjust timeline. And then if a building's being demolished, it seems like we should exempt them. But maybe it's being demolished 2 years in the future, for instance.
Yeah, thanks, Bill. Those are great suggestions. Does anyone have any thoughts in response to Bill or Paul's suggestions?
I thought Bill's comments all made a lot of sense. I agree with those. Those are great examples.
Yeah, Stacy. Thanks, Paul.
Yeah, I think they're all great suggestions and great examples. And I guess maybe Kimberly, I want to come back to, you mentioned, or I think maybe you used the word application. And so I don't know who gets to develop said application when for a building owner that's trying to apply for one of these adjusted compliance pathways or adjusted compliance pieces. But I guess I don't know that. Obviously, I think we can list a few examples and then just list or state your own, right, or whatever that is going to look like, because all kinds of people are going to have unique situations. The one piece that I was, concerned about or interested to bring up is when I read about the last bullet of the example so far, building owners experiencing financial hardship. I agree that could be an important reason to need an adjustment, but I'm curious who is going to be the one that evaluates what a financial hardship is and whether or not it's appropriate or reasonable, or, is the CEO really going to be the one to determine what a financial hardship is and what kind of documentation would they need to ask? I see it as a really important example and as a reality, but I'm really concerned about how you're going to actually ask people to demonstrate or document that and then follow through with it. I don't know. I understand its importance, but I'm concerned about the management of that type of question.
Yeah.
I'll respond very quickly, and then Kim, I want to throw it over to Will.
Sure.
But it will be up to the AQCC to decide who will implement the BPS and who will decide on this and review the documentation. And they will also be able to write the more specific rules guarding or defining or providing more specifics around financial hardship or what these applications will look like. Again, this is just general and a broad proposal. That first paragraph is really what the task force is voting on. These bullets, again, are examples of the buildings that could fall underneath this. And with that said, I'll throw it over to Will. I see you had your hand up and you're unmuted.
Thank you. Although I wasn't directly responding to this, although I do think that on this one, we would really try to follow the statutory language in 1286, which I think gives a pretty limited definition of what's meant by financial hardship. But I guess the question that I wanted to raise, and it's really sort of thinking through how we may think about these timeline adjustments in the context of building performance goals that are articulated many years in advance. So some of these, for instance, supply chains or workforce delays, that's something that seems to make sense if we were saying you need to do this next year. But if we're talking about things that are out 4 years from now and 8 years from now, where people have many years to implement, like, just, maybe this is something that we just figure out in sort of the much more detailed implementation and rules that come after an air commission rulemaking. But I'm still trying to sort of wrap my head around how we think about that. Like, if somebody came in 2029 and said, well, I'm not going to be able to meet 2030 because of workforce issues, but they've known that they needed to do this for 8 years. How do we think about that, or how do we evaluate that?
Yeah, thanks, Will. And I just wanted to share Kirk's suggestion in the chat was to remove that as an eligible criteria as well. And Michael, I see your hand is up, so I'll pass it off to you.
Oh, I was just wanting to say that I also agreed with Bill Green's list, and we've been looking at some sample buildings downtown that would do electrification, but they would need a different service level that's in the street today. And Excel really can't tell us when that service might be coming to that street. So that would be a limiting factor in doing something. I've got a live building example right now where we'd want to do something, and if we don't have 480 service, then we can't do it. So that's a real situation, and we're already trying to plan ahead. And Excel wants to be accommodating, but it's a large infrastructure project to do some of this, and not knowing when that timing is going to be. And they might not know because they have to take some things to the PUC first before they can do the construction work.
Michael, this is Keith Hay with the Energy Office. We are before the commission right now with the utilities first distribution system plan, looking at a lot of questions related to electrification. And as part of that, they are essentially heat mapping their entire system. And so we have an opportunity now to try and get ahead of this, knowing that we have, somewhere between 4 and plus years to begin to lay the groundwork for this. So
Great.
Happy to talk more with you offline about that, but I don't believe that at least the utility timeline, given the runway that we have currently, really should be an issue. Admittedly, if the project you're trying to bring in is, within the next year to year and a half, that may well be the case. But looking out, as Will said, with the long lead times, it should be a set of changes that could be made.
Well, then it would be a category that would be listed, and then we'd be very happy to find out we never needed to use it if that was the case. But that was my input. And Keith, thank you for that information.
Thanks so much, Michael. I appreciate that input. Bill.
Yeah, Keith, I wanted to respond a little bit to utility availability. We have a project right now with pretty significant electrical addition. And originally Excel told us it would be 2026 when we got that service. And now they say it's beyond that. So, depending on the area, I don't know that you can predict how long it's going to take Excel to acquire property, get right-of-ways, conduct design. It's a long process, especially with significant load increases. So we just need flexibility for that.
Yeah, thank you, Bill. And I think we'll add that to our considerations. So one piece I do think we can, well, I guess I'll mention and then pass it off to the rest of the group because I'd love to hear everyone's thoughts. Electrification is one pathway to compliance. The other and the primary is energy efficiency. And so it's important to keep that in mind as well when we're crafting these adjusted compliance options. Kirk.
As I look at some of these examples, I'm curious if there's a way that we can look at this through building characteristics that might prevent somebody from hitting a BPS target. Some of these, like the example of affordable housing, I thought was a really good example because there's almost like a policy conflict in some cases where, you know, trying to meet affordable housing, or excuse me, historical preservation goals and energy efficiency goals sometimes can be challenging, and that's around building characteristics primarily. But I would suggest anyone could apply for these adjustments, barring some sort of unique circumstance around the building, rather than some of these other market determinants or other things that are happening in the environment.
Just to clarify, all buildings can apply to either of these adjustments. It'll be up to the discretionary body to approve these. So again, these are just examples. And actually in response to you, Kirk, as well as Paul, I think it was Paul. So I apologize if it's not Paul. The last bullet we added to this slide, the inherent and unique characteristics of a physical building that prohibit them from reaching the timeline, that is also included on the target adjustment as well. So that is broad enough where there could be a building characteristics like being historical or something that could fall under.
Yeah, thanks, Crystal. And we'll talk about target adjustment as soon as we vote on the timeline adjustment piece. So other thoughts or considerations? If this looks good to folks, any thoughts around that as well would be welcome.
Kimberly, can someone re-baseline in these adjustments, or is this only specific to target timelines?
This is only specific to target and timeline because the statute specifies that it is based on the target year 2021 benchmarking data. If a new building comes online after 2021, it'll be their first year of being online. That will be their benchmarking baseline. But I will throw this over to Will if Will believes that a building can change their baseline year.
I don't believe so. Given the statutory language.
I think targets are also statutory. I'm just like occupancy is one.
And a correction, the targets are not statutory, are not in the statute. The 7%, 20% are again sector-based. A building doesn't necessarily have to make a 7% reduction. So that target again is for the whole covered building sector.
Kirk, I think it's a fantastic point, and I think where we are hoping that piece gets captured is in the target adjustment. If you have a change of occupancy, or as task force members have brought up in the past, if you have a data center move into your office building and then holy cow, your energy use jacks up, those types of things would be considered when we're thinking about adjusting the target based off of the new occupancy of the building. And thanks, there's a bunch of things coming through the chat. Great notes. Some of them are super long and I don't want to spend some time reading them. But if everyone wants to take a look, and thanks, John, my vote is that it looks good as is, and we could get too far in the weed on specific exemptions. The first paragraph states it all. Appreciate that. Does this, I know we had talked, there was a concern from task force members in the optional meeting that came up that we want to add specificity, enough specificity to this to provide building owners some level of understanding of what's coming and how they might be able to apply for these adjustments. Do we think that as is, we are reached the right level of specificity for these, for specifically the timeline adjustment proposal? Okay, I see Nori's comment in the chat. I prefer to remove workforce and supply chain delays as well.
One thing I'll see how Keith and Will feel about this. Maybe before we do the vote on this, we can do a quick vote on removing supply chain. Because I feel like we've gotten lots of comments of adding supply chain in, and we're getting lots of comments about removing it out. So I can create a very quick poll on that, see what the verdict is, and then do a final vote on the timeline adjustment. Keith, does that work?
I think that makes sense. Recognizing that that was limited to simply the 2026 deadline.
I just had one thing, if I'm allowed to say one more thing on
Please,
that.
yeah, we're definitely open.
I put some longer information in, but just so you know a little bit of what we're facing. We're doing the same. When I say we, all construction, housing, transportation, and commercial buildings, we're doing the same volume this year that we were doing in 2019. In 2019, there were 182,000 construction employees all in. This year, there are 172,000. Yes, we're doing a little bit more productivity enhancements, but we're working a record amount of overtime. In 2027, the Colorado Department of Labor and Employment tells us we need 220,000 construction employees. And you think about population growth, we're over 100,000 houses behind in just the Denver metro. Senate Bill 260, all that transportation work, and now all this utility work by Excel. We're not going to have probably 220,000 employees because every other industry is muscling in on us for the same people. And so there is going to be a long-term workforce shortage in this state compared to the demand for the amount of construction. That's just the truth. We're doing Herculean efforts to try to recruit and train. But the problem is there's so many baby boomers going out the back door that we're running in place. So that's just a reality that we're going to face probably till 2030 is a workforce shortage in construction. And Excel's going to try to turn around and contract with utility firms to build that work. So that's just a reality. Thank you.
Thank you, Michael. And so I'm reading through the lines here, but I think you would suggest we can keep that in place, at least for the 2026 deadline, if not the 2030 as well.
Well, yes, and that's just going to, supply chain is another issue, and I'm not talking about that, but the workforce is predicted to last longer than the supply chain in terms of it's going to be a long-term issue, as it is for many industries. And so it's just a reality that we're going to face. We're going to try to shove, say 30 years worth of work into between now and 2030. And it's all, the goals are great, but the workforce is going to be very tight in construction.
Thank you, Michael. And so Crystal has launched a poll for us to decide if we want to keep this bullet in the example of buildings that might apply for this adjustment. Based, and again, this is for the timeline adjustment. So please indicate via the poll which way you're feeling on this, if you'd like us to keep it in. And remember that this is just our recommendation, right? This is not the final law that will be going into effect. And so this is just the task force best recommendation for how we should treat these buildings.
And Kim and Crystal, we're looking for 12 votes on the poll. So
yes, we have 11 right now. Just give people 1 minute or a couple seconds. Okay, I will close. We only have 11 out of 12 votes, but I will close the poll.
I'm sorry, I lost mine, so I couldn't vote. Probably a technical issue on my end. I can't see it on my screen.
Michael, if you personally chat me in the Zoom chat, send me your vote and we'll include it.
Thanks, Michael. Okay, and Crystal, okay, great. So should supply chain or workforce delays be included in the timeline adjustment proposal? That is 64% yes. Michael, we'll see your answer from Crystal here in a moment. But if that sounds good to you, Crystal, I know that's just about at the 2/3 consensus. And I think maybe if Michael's vote had been in there, we would have reached that. So we will continue to keep that in place. And I think what we'll do now, since it, well, I'll open up. Are there any final comments on timeline adjustment? Are you guys ready for a vote? Okay, not hearing any. We will now vote on accepting this proposal as written on the slide for the adjusted compliance for timeline adjustment. And if this looks good to you, please vote. If it doesn't, also vote.
I got to vote this time, by the way. I figured it out.
Nice. Okay, we're missing 2 votes, it looks like. All right, and that's 12. So thank you, Crystal. It looks like 92% of us think that this looks good, and we accept this as our compliance timeline adjustment proposal for adjusted compliance. So thank you all. We appreciate all of the input that you guys gave us on this and our last couple of meetings that helped us write this proposal to reflect all of your guys's great feedback. Okay, now we are going to move on to target adjustment. And I'll just keep it in this view, Crystal and Julia. And so again, we'll go through the same process for target adjustment. This adjustment option, again, is to, instead of adjusting the timeline for compliance, it is adjusting the site EUI target that is given to a building to achieve. So I will let you guys take a moment to read this, and then we'll follow that same process of discussion and voting on this slide. And as you all have comments or thoughts, please feel free to raise your hand or unmute. We would love to hear them. Bill Green.
Okay, so I have a bunch of suggestions for target adjustments. And maybe, you know, these are somewhat repetitive, but I do believe we need affordable housing or under resourced buildings should get a target adjustment. I think you've got special building types, high energy use buildings, but there's things like data centers, call centers, hospitals, you know, proton therapy clinics, ice rinks, that sort of stuff that should get a target adjustment perhaps. Another item is reduce on-site fossil fuel combustion through electrification or alternative fuels. You know, it could very well be that we could have biofuels available, biogas available, hydrogen available, fuel cells that could reduce on-site combustion. So that would be a proposal. I also think if they could reduce EUI by 7% by 2026 and 20% by 2030, that meets the intent of the legislation. That if they could either do that or they could reduce greenhouse gases by 7% and 20%, that they shouldn't have to hit an EUI target because they met their goal for the legislation. And a couple more deep energy retrofits, maybe something like 50% EUI reduction, but they still don't hit an EUI target. You know, we've got a building right now that's 300 kBTU. And, you know, the target could be 48. If we could get that guy down 50%, you know, that's 150 kBTU. I think that would be worthy of acceptance. And then the last is maybe Energy Star score above 80. So those are my thoughts.
Thank you, Bill. Great thoughts. So in summary, I think we heard if a building meets the 7 or 20% reduction for EUI or greenhouse gas, if they've done a deep energy retrofit and can't hit the EUI target, they are a high performing building, meaning they've got a high Energy Star score, or if they're just high energy tenants in the building as well. So those are fantastic points. Thanks, Bill. Any thoughts on Bill's points?
Kimberly, I think we can provide some feedback to Bill on some of these. To your point about the affordable housing and under-resourced, we add that bullet that was included on the other adjustments, so we made sure to include it here. Also regarding the high-performing buildings having a high Energy Star score or other factors or documentation, a building owner could submit to this adjustment and then show the state that maybe they're not meeting their EUI target, but they have done these other things. That does not need to be its own pathway. And we don't necessarily need to call it out in these bullets either, because that will probably be a small subsection of buildings. Most high performing buildings will probably meet the target. If they can't, they can show that they have tried or that they are high performing and show the additional documentation. Another thing on greenhouse gas reduction, the state will be tracking that. CDPHE and the Air Division will be tracking that. And that's something that we actually talk about in the next slide, is that the task force decided that the main metric will be site EUI. So if a building owner believes that they have made great GHG reductions, again, they could submit the target adjustment and be like, here, I can show you that I made GHG reductions. However, my EUI has not gone down. It does not need to be its own special pathway it does not need to be its own special pathway. And that could be something that could be really complicated and confusing to building owners, because some will be like, why do I need to comply with the EUI target? And others get to comply with the GHG reduction. So again, this is broad. These bullets are examples, but essentially any building owner can submit the documentation and plead their case of, I cannot meet my target for such and such a reason. Here's my good faith effort and the documentation and characteristics of my building of why I believe that I should be able to have this adjustment. And I think someone in the chat even asked, if you submit an adjustment, you're not automatically in compliance. The AQCC will decide those details, but when you submit documentation, whoever that governing body is, the state, CEO, they will start that conversation with the building owner. That will come through that process. You don't just submit an adjustment and automatically in or out of compliance. That will be something that the AQCC will figure out when they write the rules. Kim, I know I missed some of Bill's points, so feel free to respond to any of those.
Yeah, thanks, Crystal. And Bill, I think the only one that Crystal missed is if that deep energy retrofit happens at the building level and they reduce their site EUI by 50%, I think that falls under the category of, unusually high energy use building. And to the documentation piece at the bottom, they can demonstrate through documentation that deep energy retrofit was the maximum that they were really able to achieve in that project for EUI. So I think we might have that one covered in this slide as well. And thanks, Joel, for your thoughts on the EV piece. We added this in after our discussion at the optional meeting. And so thank you for that suggestion on shifting the fourth bullet to include EV chargers that can't be accounted for in portfolio manager. And that's really what we were trying to get at with that bullet. So that's helpful. And from Katrina, I would remove the second bullet around high energy use tenants. This should be accounted for if the building owner benchmarks properly for that tenant use type, as long as they're mixed blended targets for the buildings. Great point, Katrina. Any thoughts on Katrina's statement, or Katrina, if you want to add to your comment? Not hearing any. I guess I'm just trying to think through, and I'm not an expert in portfolio manager. But if there are blended targets, EUI targets coming from the state, that would factor in if it was a mixed use building, say, for example, with a data center in it. Is that correct? Okay. So that should be captured within portfolio manager, and we shouldn't need a consideration for it. Okay. All right, Bill, I see your hand up. Pass it back to you.
Yeah, I'd like to respond to that. You know, portfolio manager reports, as I understand it, EUI, and it changes Energy Star score based on occupancy, and perhaps weather normalizes EUI. But you know, if you have a data center with 100 watt a square foot data center is about 3,000 kBTU. Okay, so how do they hit an EUI target? You know, you have to allow for super high energy use uses within the building to adjust the target. So.
And just to chime in here, that is something that is factored in with the property type specific EUI targets. So a data center, most likely based on the average of data centers in the state, that target would be way much higher than a hospital or office or whatever other lower EUI building. And if they are an exception, again, they can apply to this and be like, yes, the data center average is 400 and something in the state. However, mine is much higher than that. So that would fall under this adjustment, and they would be able to submit that documentation showing that.
Thanks, Crystal. And Laura, did you want to respond to that as well?
Yeah, I was just going to note that Energy Star for data centers in particular does not use EUI as their metric. They do use PUE. So it is, yeah, that is accounted for. It is on a, they know it's a high energy use. They don't look at EUI for Energy Star.
Oh, great. That's super helpful. Thanks, Laura. Stacy.
I wanted to ask for clarification again about, so if this is to adjust the site EUI target, but we just asked about changing a baseline earlier and maybe reasons why a building could or could not change its baseline. But if I have a building and I totally gut it and renovate it during this period of years, or its use type changes dramatically, either through a major remodel or a major retrofit, either my target needs to change or my site EUI is going to change dramatically and would shift my target. So is there a way to account for significant remodels or repurposing of building types?
Yeah, thanks, Stacey. I think that's a great point. So this third bullet here, I think, was aiming to get at that, but maybe with significant variations in operations, you know, maybe doesn't go far enough. Maybe it's significant variations. And do you have well, first I'll point you to this bullet and ask, does that seem to cover us, or do you think we could add a couple words to that to account for what you're saying?
I'm going to chime in really. I think I'm going to chime in really quickly. That is a very important consideration. So thanks for bringing that up, Stacy. I actually think that can be information that is included in the recommendations themselves. So that would pertain to a target or a timeline adjustment, because perhaps their big gut or renovation also changes their timeline. So I think if something like that changes their use type and things like that, that is actually something that, Stacy, if you actually want to put that in the chat too, we can summarize that, make sure it's in the meeting notes, and put that in the recommendations as a whole, that the AQCC should also consider or remember this, that building use types and these things could change. I think that would help frame the recommendations around these adjustments very nicely. I don't think we need to add another target on here or another bullet on here.
Okay, thanks, Crystal, and thanks, Stacy, for bringing that up. All right, any other thoughts from the group on the target adjustment? I'll highlight that. right. Yeah, Julia, I
Stacy-
just unmuted. Mhm.
Yeah, I just wanted to note that Stacy threw in the chat, adding some language to account for that major remodel for that last little bit of discussion there. So if people are supportive, we can throw that in.
Julia, we're gonna put that in the recommendations as a whole, not.
Oh, gotcha. Yeah.
If the task force feels ready and there's no other questions or concerns, we can start a vote on this.
And I'll give it just a few seconds because I know that there's a lot to take in on this slide. So I want to make sure everyone has a chance to read it. Okay. I am sensing from, oh, great, Kirk.
Sorry, I just, Joel, I'm processing the EV charging station piece now. The EVs it was my understanding that EVs could be included within Portfolio Manager. It just gets, as long as it's separately sub-metered. So does that need to be a category here?
The state and Lotus looked into this and we got some feedback from EPA of that sometimes it is sub-metered and include that in Energy Star. And then if you don't have, if it's not sub-metered via the utility, that when you have the smart, I don't know, I'm not an expert with this, but the actual smart meters that tells you the EV usage, that the building owner themselves would have to separate that out from their Energy Star or their building usage and put that into Energy Star. So there were ways to separate it out in Energy Star. So we put that consideration into here, and that's why we kept it broad so that the AQCC could still look into that and consider that.
Okay, sorry. Thank you.
No, great question. And Joel, did you want to add anything to that?
No, just to reinforce what Crystal said. Yeah, they can sub-meter it themselves because utilities generally don't do that, which means it's not going to be automatically fed into Portfolio Manager. Or they can download like a spreadsheet from a smart charger and upload that to Portfolio Manager. But if they don't have either of those two options, we still don't want it to be restrictive of EV charging. So if they have a dumb charger that just passes through electricity, that should still be allowed, and we should still have an adjustment available for that. That's my position.
Yeah. Thanks, Joel. So Katrina dropped in the chat. I think we agreed to take out the second bullet before voting. I think it might make sense to do a vote on just if we want to take out that high energy use tenant bullet. Crystal, if that makes sense to you. I think I heard arguments on both sides of the equation there. So I want to make sure we're capturing everybody's thoughts on that correctly. So while Crystal gets that vote ready, we'll vote whether we want to delete or keep that bullet in there, and then we can move forward with a vote for the whole target adjustment proposal. I think we're going to get better at these writing the proposals things because you guys have had very few comments on this one. It feels good.
Okay, I think it's ready. Apologize to the task force about this. Zoom does not make this easy to edit on the fly. So I think this is it.
Thanks, Crystal. And while you're launching that, Paul shared, I think the third bullet makes the second bullet unnecessary. And Katrina agrees it creates a loophole to keep it in there, and it isn't necessary if the building is benchmarked correctly. So with all of that in mind, please go ahead and cast your votes on whether we should include it or not in this proposal.
And Lotus, I'll confirm, I believe we still have 12 task force members.
Great,
I'm still waiting for 12 votes. Okay, we only have 11 votes, and I don't know why it cut off, but if someone did not vote, please feel free to message me in the Zoom chat privately with your vote.
Oh, sorry about that, Joel. Even with the Zoom voting, you'd think that technology would be smooth at this point. It's still not. So
I'm really sorry, Joel. It literally just stopped the vote for me. It just said 11 out of 11, so I apologize.
That's okay. I'll message you, Crystal. Thanks.
Thanks. Okay.
While Joel is doing that, then Bill Green notes that he disagrees with taking it out, and Paul asks a great question, which is what could take place that the third bullet wouldn't cover? Like, what does the second bullet imply that the third bullet would not also include? Bill, looks like you're doing it over a little. You're muted.
You know, Paul asks hard questions. So, well, again, these are examples that might apply. And so to me, high energy use is different than variations in operations from standard buildings. So, what is standard about a proton therapy clinic, that has a cyclotron in the basement? I mean, there's, maybe, I don't know.
Maybe a variation operation could cover exactly that. That's a great example. That's an unusual operational aspect of a building. So
yeah,
that's
right.
why I was getting comfortable with that third bullet,
right,
encompassing what the second is trying to do.
Okay.
I think you guys are kind of discussing use types that potentially wouldn't be covered by portfolio manager in that case.
Yeah, and that's true.
And it slipped through the cracks between the general categories that portfolio manager covers.
And so if it's not covered by portfolio manager, then that would just be included as a percentage of the use type for the whole building, right? And so wouldn't you just follow the portfolio manager rules in that case?
As much as possible, I think.
Okay. Well, so with Joel's vote included, we had a majority to remove the second bullet. So we're going to go ahead and remove that. And Bill, we will keep your consideration in mind. And if there is another idea that comes to you on how we can rework that second bullet, the second bullet, to account for what you're thinking about, let us know. But I think as far as providing these high level examples, I think we can say we're pretty well covered with the bullets that we have on the page right now. So I'm going to open up the floor. Oh, okay, here we go. And we're ready to vote. So we'll go ahead and take a vote on this target adjustment proposal as written on the slide in front of you.
I'll try not to cut anyone off this time. Well, Zoom again is telling me I have 10 out of 10. So I think some task force members may be calling in. If you're calling in, the Zoom poll may not be accounting for you. So I'll leave it open for a couple more seconds because we're missing one task force member. But if you're not able to vote, please put it in the chat to me. And I think that's what's happening here. Okay, I'm going to close the poll.
All right. Great. So 92%, 11 out of 12 of us agree that this should be the target adjustment proposal. So thank you all for your vote. We will move forward with including this as one of our recommendations in the building performance standard. Okay, so now before we close out our discussion on adjusted compliance, and I'll go back into presenter view. Here we go. Oh, let me get this out of here. So before we move away from adjusted compliance, we wanted to take a moment to check in and make sure that there are no additional concerns or questions about where we've landed with adjusted compliance. There were a couple of suggestions that came out of the optional meeting, and we've included those on the slide here with sort of a response from the CEO on how we want to think about these considerations. So there was an idea to remove renewable energy from core compliance and put it in the adjusted compliance. And we have already voted that in as a core compliance pathway to apply renewables to meet the site EUI target. Another idea that had been brought up was to allow buildings to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, but not site EUI, to use greenhouse gas emissions as the metric for achieving compliance. And we think that this can be covered and evaluated through our target adjustment option. And then finally, providing a pathway for buildings with EV chargers that are not submetered. And we, as you all know, you saw we added this into the target adjustment option, and we can continue to share this with the AQCC so they can consider this when writing their rules. So these are a couple of the suggested, I guess, concerns or questions that came out of the optional meeting. And for those who weren't able to attend the optional meeting, we wanted to open it up to see, are there any additional concerns or questions that we have in regard to adjusted compliance that we need to think about? And Paul, I will pass it to you.
Yeah, just a quick question on that middle one about using GHG versus EUI. I like having that option. I just wanted to clarify, if a building owner chooses that option, do they have to show GHG emission reductions apart and separate from the inherent improvement in GHG from grid efficiency?
Yes. That would be correct.
Okay, so I just want to clarify. To me, it's really important to make sure that that is absolutely clear to both building owners and those who will be administering this.
Yes, and to be clear, this is included. Let me reword that. If building owners submit a target adjustment, they can argue their case of, hey, I made GHG reductions, but this is not something that has its own pathway that is being called out. Again, site EUI is the main metric. The AQCC can flush this out if they choose so. Again, the state is tracking GHG reductions a different way than Energy Star will be. So that would be a very tricky path for building owners to go down of, if they're tracking their reductions one way and the state another, that opens a very just tricky way of demonstrating it and verifying it. So a building owner can submit to the target adjustment and be like, hey, I've done these things. The site UI is still not going down. However, I believe my emissions went down. Just to clarify, we're not making this its own pathway or anything like that.
Yeah. Thanks, Crystal. Any other questions or thoughts from folks?
Kim, I think we can move on to the next slide about with the big BPS matrix. I think the task force would benefit in seeing that.
Okay, sure. Just wanted to make sure that if there weren't any other questions, we could answer those. So if they come up, feel free to share those. If there are still concerns, feel free to share those, and we will keep ourselves moving. Just one quick comment from Bill. I think what bothers me is the wording from a standard building in that building type category. If there's no category for that building use, then does it count as an exemption? Thanks, Bill, for that. And we will maybe circle up offline with you and figuring out how to adjust that language in that target. Okay. So we're going to skip through to this matrix here, and then we can go ahead and move to our break after this. So there's a lot to look at right now. I will walk you guys through what we've developed, and hopefully you guys spent some time with this before the meeting today to orient yourselves. So this was our attempt to create a visual representation of the core compliance and adjusted compliance options for the building performance standard. So starting in the upper left-hand corner, the main compliance metric is site EUI. Now there are two primary mechanisms to achieving that site EUI target. The first is electrification of 80% of your space and domestic hot water heating loads. And that was voted on as a recommendation in meeting number 8, last meeting with the task force. Or you can pursue energy efficiency projects at your building. So if you electrify 80% of your load, you've met the site EUI target. building owners may do efficiency measures that get them to meet their site EUI target. If buildings do that efficiency work and they're still not getting to the site target, then they move over to this category of options. They can apply partial credit for renewables, partial credit for partial electrification, and partial credit for integration of demand flexibility. And recall, I know we have not finalized and voted on this piece, but because we have discussed it, we included it in this matrix to have a complete visual of what we're proposing. Again, this box here clarifies that for these actions, it is partial credit only that applies to the site EUI, and that documentation is required for these. So now to get to what if you're still not meeting your site target, and we'll follow this path and then we'll come back over here for this path. If you've done all of these things and you're still not meeting your target, you have an option to apply for adjusted compliance, and that can be target or a timeline adjustment. If you already know right off the bat that that site EUI target is so far out of reach that you're going to have an issue hitting the target or meeting the timeline, you can pursue right off the bat those adjusted compliance options for target and timeline adjustment. So hopefully this helps clarify things in folks' minds of how all of these recommendations will kind of weave together. But we would love to know if there are any suggested changes to this or suggestions on how to make this look clearer or make more sense for somebody who has not sat through all of our task force meetings and is looking at this, maybe scratching their heads. If you have any suggestions or if the way we walked through it makes sense to you all. Kirk.
Other jurisdictions like DC and Washington State include these rebaselining target years. So they recalibrate their targets. Is that something that Colorado will consider as well as we move forward in this program?
That's something that CEO will look into, but the preliminary response is no.
So the baseline year will always be 2021, even after the interim target of 2026.
Yes, and that is written into statute.
Okay.
Good question. Thank you, Kirk. From Stacy, on the far left row of the pathway, can the or be and or? Yes, it can. That's a great suggestion. Thank you, Stacy. Joel.
Can you refresh my memory? Why was renewables not in the left column as a main compliance pathway?
Sure. So the way that we, through the discussions on renewable energy, we heard from the task force that we wanted to emphasize efficiency first before buildings move to using renewable energy to support compliance. So this is not to say a building cannot use renewable energy, right? It's to say, first, let's think about energy efficiency and get that as far as you can get it. And then renewables will credit. Sorry.
I'll also chime in here too. Like we've heard that, like what Kim said, that efficiency comes first as the purpose of a building performance standard. But something we also want to avoid, which we heard several task members bring up, is that we don't want a building owner to not do any energy efficiency measures or not reduce their load and just do renewables. And so we want to make sure that it's clear that renewables are not required. It is optional. It's going to require additional documentation. Building owners definitely can do it, but we don't want them just getting solar and not reducing their load or subscribing to something. So that's something, and that would then create that loophole of a building owner lowering their emissions, but not their EUI. So that's something we want to be cautious with.
Thanks, Crystal. Karen.
Yeah, and I had been thinking the same thing as Stacy initially about the and or, and I think it's or because I took a minute to think about it's not and. If you meet 80%, it's or. So I just wanted to clarify that. I don't think this is an and or on the left side. I don't know if other people agree, but I think if you can't get to 80%, then you have to do energy efficiency and you would be less than 80%. So it's not and. So anyway, I hope that makes sense.
Yeah, Karen, and then thanks. I did respond right off the gut to that one, but I think you make a great point. We have, as you guys can see over here, partial electrification for partial credit. So if you don't meet that 80% electrification, you move to energy efficiency, and then whatever partial electrification you could complete would provide partial credit. Thanks, Karen. Kirk.
Does the electrification piece, as well as the renewables panel electrification demand flexibility, would those provisions also cover or be required for public buildings? The statute specifically carves out public buildings and a section regarding percentage of the covered building square footage, and then also dollar amounts. And so I'm just curious if there's going to be a separate pathway for public buildings here.
Kirk, there is no separate pathway for public buildings. There are restrictions listed in statute that if a renovation or retrofit or whatever a public building is doing, if it's over a certain amount, they do not need to do it. But all of this, a public building could apply to a public building. So there is no separate pathway for public buildings.
Thanks, Crystal. Thanks, Kirk, for that great question. Nori.
Hi, yeah, so it seems like you start with electrification or energy efficiency, you don't meet your site EUI, and then you bundle renewables or partial or demand. Seems like there should then be an arrow right after that combination of, again, the site EUI is met after doing that, or you go back and it's still not met and you keep working at it. Is that right?
Yeah, I think that is right, Nori. So there might be maybe after these, there's an arrow coming out this way that says these three helped you meet your site EUI target. If not, you come down here.
Right.
Yeah. No, thanks. I think that's helpful.
Just like the blue bullets on the left. And then the second part is, do you really intend to have property requires a compliance adjustment as an or under energy efficiency? Because you wouldn't know that. Well, actually, maybe you would. Would you not know that until you still don't meet your site EUI? Is that really where the property is going to require a compliance adjustment?
Yeah, that's a great question. Not being maybe a fully versed expert in this, I would say it probably is property type specific. There might be an example to one of Bill's high energy use buildings where they get a target and it's 75% lower than their EUI, and they're like, that's not going to happen. So they might pursue that route first. Where
any energy efficiency work at all. I think you're right. Okay, got it.
Okay.
And I'll provide some clarity with that one too, with the property on the left-hand side, properties require a compliance adjustment. We included that because we know, like what Bill was saying, what you brought up, Nori, too, that maybe this does not preclude them from electrification or energy efficiency or anything. It's just that they receive their target and they're like, there's no way we can do this, or this is a mistake, or this is the wrong property type. They can start that process. So we want to acknowledge that there could be several different ways to the compliance adjustment.
Gotcha. Okay. Yeah, I see.
And Stacy, maybe to get to your point a bit, and I can adjust this offline and we can send it, but maybe the two green boxes on the left move up next to each other, and then the arrows from those two go out to site EUI met or not met, because that then indicates that those two are on an equal playing field for your compliance options versus one visually above the other, if that helps.
I think it'd just be really nice to be able to show the easiest path is not to do the compliance adjustment, just get your electrification and your energy efficiency done, and woohoo, you've met your site EUI. and to encourage that, even if I'm trying to advocate for affordable housing units, it'd still be nice to show a super easy path as do what it takes to get site EUI before you just say, it's going to be easier to go with a compliance adjustment up front, so I'm not even going to try it.
Right. Yeah. Thank you, Nori, for that. And I do want to call attention to a couple of comments in the chat. And I know that, and these are related to the penalty a building would pay compared to the potential cost for compliance. And Bill shared in the chat the fines, and those are written in statute. So those will not be changing. But it's definitely something I think that we can keep in mind, especially as we're moving into our discussion in the second half of the meeting today on programs for compliance. What programs can we recommend that might fill in that gap for building owners or push them towards compliance versus fine payments? Paul, I'll pass it to you.
I was just going to mention, I raised that point because I was asked just yesterday by a building owner who said, why wouldn't I just pay the fine? I can't imagine any of these will cost less than that fine. So I think it's a very real possibility. We could have a significant percentage of building owners looking at that as their compliance path. So I'm in no way advocating for that. I want to make it clear. But as I was asked that just yesterday, I thought I'd share that. Maybe in the second part of this meeting, we start to talk about how do we make sure the carrot is more tempting than the stick in this case. So thanks.
Yeah, thanks, Paul. I think it's a really, really important point. Okay. Any other thoughts on this matrix? Does it help sort of piece all of the pieces of that we've discussed together in a way that hopefully you guys can use this to explain to your constituents and folks in your network on how all of this will work and come together? Okay, I'm not hearing any other comments. So with that, Crystal, Stacy, I saw you unmuted. No. Sorry, I've got my eyes on you guys. So if you unmute, I'm always ready to call on you. Oh, Stacy, you're unmuted, but I can't hear you. Okay, no worries. All right. Well, then in that case, I think what we'll do is we'll go ahead and move to the break. And we'll take a 10-minute break and we'll come back and we'll discuss the programs for compliance, workforce considerations, and equity considerations. So keep those wheels turning in your mind. If you think of anything, if you haven't had anything in mind related to those three, be prepared to share those ideas when we get back. So if everyone, we'll call you guys back at 2:35. So enjoy your break and we'll talk to you guys soon.
Kim, if you can move it to the break side, perfect.
So we'll give everyone a moment to arrive back at their computers, and I'm going to pass it off to Julia to take the lead on the second half of our meeting.
Thanks, Kim.
Really quickly, I want to throw it over to Will Tor. He wanted to mention something after the break.
Yeah, no, I just wanted to thank folks for raising the question around fines and whether that level of fines is enough to actually motivate building owners to comply. And, I think it's a very good question. And, I think there's some ambiguity in the statute about what constitutes a subsequent violation. It speaks to a first violation and a subsequent violation. There's probably a question that the Error Commission will need to grapple with when adopting the rules about how they define violations. And if somebody remains out of compliance, is there some time period in which you say, okay, that's another violation and then another violation and another violation. And so certainly a question that I think we will be, making sure that the Air Commission considers and the Air Division consider as they're adopting the rules.
Thanks for sharing that, Will. I think that's really good information for this committee, this task force to have as we think about what this actually looks like in terms of implementation and how the long-term program is going to be managed and enforced. So it looks like we've got mostly everybody back. I've got a couple of folks still don't have their cameras on. So just give us a wave with your little reactions if you're, oh, there you are. Thanks, guys. All right. Great. Well, Kim, if you want to advance us forward to the next slide, please. Perfect. Thanks. So as Kim mentioned, we are going to discuss the program's workforce and equity considerations. This is not our only discussion that we'll have about these topics, but really this is an opportunity for us to start brainstorming and thinking about what it looks like for CEO to what it looks like for us to include recommendations to the AQCC on programs to support compliance, and ultimately likely what these are things that CO may be implementing. So we're going to be asking, excuse me, some specific questions around what resources can be provided, what tools do we need to make sure are available. Again, as Kim noted, this is not our only time to discuss this, so we'll dive into this a little bit more in our next optional meeting, and then even further in meeting 10. I'm mixing up my numbers here. So know that if ideas come up after we've discussed today, if we don't have a chance to dive into everything in as much detail as you might like, then there will be more opportunity to continue this conversation. We have about a half an hour, I believe, on the agenda allotted for this conversation. So since we've got sort of three buckets here that we're talking about: programs to support compliance, and then specifically equity considerations and workforce considerations. We'll spend about 10 minutes on each of those. So if I, at some point, say, okay, thank you, and we're going to move on, then know that that's not because we think we've gotten all the information that we need from you. Again, we'll continue to talk about this, but that's just to make sure that we can kind of touch on each of those buckets briefly today so that we can dive into them in more detail in the future. Kim, if you want to move us forward to the next slide. All right, great. So specifically, when we're thinking about programs to support compliance, I thought maybe some useful framing behind this might be thinking back to those goals that we set initially as sort of the guiding principles of the task force. And specifically, when we think about programs to support compliance, we've got some goals that relate to equity and workforce. So we'll talk about those when we talk about those two specific buckets. But when we're talking more broadly about programs to support compliance, I want to refer back to our cost goals and our streamlined process goals. So in relation to our cost goals, we noted that we wanted to ensure that there were financing options available and promoted. There were flexibility and options for compliance, that the state offer resources and incentives, and we develop a business case for compliance, or a business case for and then in regard to streamlined process, the guiding principles that we really noted were ensuring building control over targets and consistency in the language, reducing administrative burden. So I think that's something that we can, that's one in particular that I would suggest we think about in terms of programs to support compliance, and then including flexibility in pathways, and focusing on low performing buildings and coordinating with local programs. So that's kind of a lot and a mouthful. It looks like I'm going to guess, Kim, you're throwing that into the chat right now. So thank you for that. And that's sort of the framing that I wanted to have us have in the back of our mind as we start to think about these programs. So I'll just open it up to you all to start to discuss and answer some of these questions. What information would help building owners understand the BPS? What challenges could building owners face when they are complying? And what resources might help address these challenges? And then we'll note again that we'll dig into equity and workforce specifically in about 10 minutes. So if no one unmutes themselves, then go ahead, Karen. Thank you.
Yeah, I guess it would just be in my neck of the woods in Aurora for a building owner to understand if they were low performing, you know, just to understand what the definition is. And so for that, it would be do we know, do we have a list of the bad buildings? Is that something that they'll have where they could check to see if they're on a list? I mean, it would help for the ones that are the least savvy to be able to say, oh, I fall in this category. So that would be helpful for our building owners, some of our building owners.
Great. Crystal, I saw you unmuted yourself there briefly. Did you want to respond or?
No, sorry.
Okay. All right. Good. No, that's great context. Thanks, Karen. Yeah, making sure that people understand kind of where they fall, and if this is something that they're really going to need to maybe be working at a little more diligently than other building owners.
Yeah, I just wanted to say the high performing buildings know who they are and
Right.
they have resources. So it's just the ones that don't. And then I guess there's probably a gray area in between.
One thing I can provide some information on is that with our benchmarking program at the end of each compliance cycle, so after December 1st of this year, the state will be sending out postcards, not postcards, kind of fancy cards of here's your site UI, this is your energy usage, and then in the future years will also be like, this is where you fall within your property type once we have more data. So your suggestion is very good, Karen. Just letting you know that at least with the benchmarking side, each year the buildings at least will be able to see their EUI and start to understand where they fall at least. But that is a really good suggestion.
That's great context. Thanks, Crystal. John, I saw you raise your hand.
Yeah, and then I lowered it. I realized I'm okay. Thank you.
You're good. Okay, great. Stacy, please. Oh, not. You're good. Okay. Not hearing you.
Yeah, we still can't. Your sound is still not coming through. If you wanted to log out of the meeting and log back in, we will certainly let you right back in. That might help.
Well, Stacey, if you hop out and back in, then we'll turn back to you once you hop back in. Paul.
Yeah, I was going to mention that I always think the importance of in-person communication is underestimated these days. And I wanted to share that when we rolled out the NGO high performance building program back in 2009-10, we did a series of workshops around the state. And we made a particular point to go to smaller communities and be present there. We invited designers, contractors, building owners, construction managers, contractors. We had great attendance at those sessions, often you have 50 or 60. And we went to places like Alamosa, Pueblo, Steamboat, Monument, Greeley. And, so I think don't assume it can all be on Zoom or on the website. There is tremendous value to being out in the community across the state and being able to answer questions and be in person and help people understand. So just wanted to share what I thought was a very positive experience from now a decade ago.
That's great. Thanks, Paul. That's a really good point. I think we've all gotten very used to this virtual world that we're living in, and can sometimes take it for granted that that a little in-person communication can go a very long way. Perfect. All right, Stacy has happened back in, so hopefully we'll be able to hear him at this point, but I'll turn my eyes to the chat really quick and note that Karen also noted translation services and materials in different languages. And I think this is a great point, asking what language the owner is most comfortable in and communicating with them in that language is great. And I think we even included, if I'm remembering correctly, some pretty specific language in our guiding principles around inclusive language and language accessibility. So fantastic. Any other thoughts? As we're thinking about maybe even these in-person or virtual meetings, then is it trainings? Is it providing resources? What would that really look like, Paul?
I want to offer one suggestion, which could the energy office work with local municipal permitting agencies so that if something is flagged as a building permit that's related to the building performance program, it gets expedited. As you know, the delays in getting building permits right now can be a real problem.
Yeah.
So just a thought.
Yeah, great idea. Thanks. Bill Green.
Yeah, I've conducted several sessions over the past few months, and I agree with Paul that in person is good. Targeting certain, audiences like BOMA, IFMA, 7x24, those guys have very specific challenges for their type of building that they need answered. Denver has also done a very good job with the Energize Denver ordinance. They have, webinars, they have websites, they have presentations. But, still people ask questions. It's not well known that this is in place. So those sorts of things would help, certainly.
Yeah,
So I'll chime in here too to help frame this conversation. Programs, workforce, and equity. What we're talking about is suggestions to the AQCC of how this should be implemented after June of 2023. To preface this is that over the next few months, CO will be reaching out and doing that public engagement and reaching out to these different audiences to inform them of the task force's recommendations and the process and how the process is moving forward. So when we're talking about helping the building owners understand the BPS, we are referring to the future after June 2023. We are hearing you now and taking some of this input for the public engagement process, but just know that this is for after June 2023, not June that's upcoming.
Yeah, that's a great clarifying point. Thanks, Crystal. Karen.
I just mentioned, just because I just worked with an engineer who is his first language is Arabic, and I wondered if we could suggest that there be we need people. I don't know the English words for some of this stuff, so if you get just a translation service, they may not know all of the terminology and the way to speak to them. And so I was thinking about that engineer. We need a core group of either volunteers or paid who not only speak the language, but they know the business. And I don't know if there's resources for that, but that would be gold for us.
That's a really interesting point. Yeah. Sometimes that technical language can definitely be lost in translation. So having someone can speak to it specifically. To Crystal's point, and we'll dive in just a second here to specific equity and workforce considerations and programs that could be developed. But to Crystal's point, are there, aside from these opportunities to really get the word out, to provide trainings and things of that nature, are there any other programs or resources that once building owners are required to adhere to benchmarking and BPS, then, and specifically BPS, then like specific resources that would support them at that point, rather than kind of getting them on board and informed prior to June of 2023?
I was going to say case studies seem like they are one of the most helpful, instructive pieces we can provide. So to the extent the energy office can start to gather and prepare those case studies and make them really concise and make sure they include the critical information for building owners. And that's very helpful. Yeah, I like Bill's suggestion too, certified providers. Yeah.
Yeah, great suggestion. Thanks, Paul, and great suggestion from Bill in the chat on a list of certified providers that can really speak to these requirements and have passed some sort of exam illustrating that they can do so.
Yeah, what I found is that the more specific we can get, the more it is helpful. People really want that kind of detailed information.
Yeah, absolutely. Great.
We don't have to hammer on the why. It's the how do I do this that seems to be what people are looking for.
Mm-hmm.
And then I would just, I know hotlines have kind of gone out of style, but that thing where you're right in the middle of something and you thought you knew how to do it and you have a question, it's not just understanding it. Once you get in it, if you've never used any of this stuff before, you're going to get in the middle of it and not know how to complete it. So that was the other thing, is maybe a resource line or something, so that if somebody has a question, they can get it answered when they're in the middle, whatever language they speak.
Great. Thanks, Karen. Stacy, I know you had something you wanted to share previously. Are we able to hear you now, or is it anything? You're good? Okay, great. Well, let's dive in specifically into equity first, and seeing if there's anything specific that we might be able to think of in terms of supportive programs, supportive resources in the equity space, in order to ensure that building owners can comply with the BPS. Kim, could you advance this forward one slide? Thank you. Great. So the state has definitely made a very vocal commitment to equity throughout many processes, and this one is one of those many processes that that the state is really looking to incorporate equity into the work that comes out of this. So really, we're interested in learning, what are those resources that that might be available? How can the BPS ensure that certain building owners and tenants aren't disproportionately impacted? And then, most importantly, what resources are needed in order to meet equity goals? And I think, that's really what we're really where we'd love to spend the most time in our discussion today is talking about what resources are needed and might be able to be provided. Karen.
Yeah, I guess I'm not thinking of this as equity. I'm thinking that it could be abuse of tenants, and that building owners could pass costs or whatever. I don't know if that's equity, but I guess it's just making sure. I'm not sure what you can do there. That's a private arrangement. So I'm having difficulty with, I don't care what flavor the tenants are, I guess. It's just that building owners aren't sticking it to the tenants and passing on costs that are maybe unfair, but maybe they are. And so I'm having a hard time with this one. I guess maybe if somebody could explain this one to me a little more on how this would happen. How could equity be impacted by this? And some examples would help me.
Yeah, I think to start with, and I'll open it up to see if anyone wants to jump in as well, but we've talked a lot about affordable housing and the impact that these standards might have on affordable housing developers and affordable housing building owners in terms of adding additional costs that they might not be able to absorb without needing to pass those costs forward to tenants. So I think that's the one that jumps to mind most readily for me. But if there's any other examples folks want to throw out.
And I guess I thought the affordable housing, and I could be totally wrong on this, they are protected somewhat because it's income qualified and there are rules around raising rents or whatever after the fact. So I don't know if Nori could speak to that.
Sure, I think that's a great point, because some of the larger buildings or nonprofit and housing authorities will have those protections in place, but there's so many market rate affordable that are not governed by those deed restrictions or affordability covenants that are going to pass this on to their tenants. And I think that's where we can use some of the same, you can't raise rents more than once a year. You can't, and X percentage per year. Some of the things that are already in the affordability covenants and language, we could build into this if people are interested, so that people aren't getting 3 rent increases in a year, and some of the protections like that. Because if they are immediately passing it on, especially before they've even done the work, then the tenant's not benefiting at all. They're just getting the higher rent so that the owner can save up enough money in order to do the work that they think they're going to do, and never pass on the utility cost savings from the energy efficiency metrics to the tenants. They're just going to raise the rents in order to make some of these improvements that may or may not come through. So I think that that's probably going to be quite a bit of the multifamily stock, is that not protected with affordability covenants, but lower income tenants and probably under-resourced buildings where you would see this happening. But the resources,
yeah, sorry, I get that makes sense to me, except that I'm trying to figure out, I don't know what we can do to, and maybe somebody will come up with something really great, but market's the market. I'm having a hard time with, they can charge what they want right now. And I don't know that it's because of this or something else. I don't know how we would tell. So it's just a tough spot to try to say we can do this or that will help not pass those on without those covenants that you're talking about, the ones that protect the capital A, affordable. So this one just seems like a really tough nut to crack. And I'm afraid, again, enforcement is an issue when you have a regulation.
And I think this is Keith from the Energy Office. I apologize. I had to switch to my phone because I'm driving to a public meeting tonight in Pueblo on behalf of the office. I think when we think about this, we've heard in part from the task force about under-resourced buildings, in, the qualified space and the low and moderate income space. And as you think about those challenges of what it means for you as building owners, developers, to be an under-resourced building, what does that mean, and what are the things that would be valuable in terms of resources that could help close that gap, so that those buildings that serve these populations are then able to come up to the standards that are there? I think that's really where we have been trying to focus, not trying to put in place a regulation necessarily that protects tenants. That's not the purview of the task force, nor within sort of what the Energy Office would be able to do. And so we're trying to think about, what does the state as a whole have as a set of resources that we can help bring to close that resource gap from the building side of things?
Yeah, and I think that's my point. Aurora has their share, just like I'm sure all communities of the slumlords. We find out that some of these, the refugees transition into attached single family or multifamily. And we find out by accident that they don't have working plumbing. And so I've got that, and I'm thinking, how am I supposed to do this on top of that, where they are under-resourced, but we have to catch them doing it. And we're not catching them putting these people in with no working plumbing. So it's just that's where I'm coming from, is I'm the housing, multifamily and single family attached product. These property owners it's not under-resourced. I wouldn't call it that. It's just a bad situation. So I'm coming at it from a different place, I guess. I want this to work, but I want them to have working plumbing too. So
I understand that, but I guess one of the questions is, how are you catching them, and what's the resource gap that is making it the case that you're not aware that these buildings are complying with, minimum health and safety standards, let alone energy standards? It seems like there's a resource gap there. That's what we're asking to have you help us identify, and then see if there's a way to help close that. No commitment that it's a thing we can do, but you all are on the front line of
identifying those resource gaps, and we're asking for you all to help us with that.
Yeah, and for us, and Keith, if your plumbing wasn't working and you were renting, there would be no question that you would let the landlord know. They don't let the landlord know. They're scared. They're in a different country. You know, I'll just say there's some other barriers. So the landlords can get away with it. So it's self-reporting a lot of times, and it's only when somebody goes in to check on child welfare or those kind of things. So I agree. I really want a resource for this, but I'm going to have to think about this one.
Yeah,
I could share a little
ahead,
bit
Katrina.
about the resources that Denver is putting in place with our policy, just to give the task force some ideas to pull from. So we are working really hard to identify all under-resourced buildings, so not just affordable housing, but it was really important to our task force that we look at buildings where there's lots of businesses located that may be under-resourced businesses in low-income areas, or just really under-resourced parts of the city where those buildings might need support, buildings that are a priority to those communities. So casting a pretty broad net. And we are going to be offering kind of basic answer the phone, answer questions level of support for all buildings, but those under-resourced buildings will get a bunch of extra technical assistance to help them plan out what action they want to take in their building to reach the targets. And that's sort of our tier 2 level of support. And then because we have climate protection fund funding in Denver, we're also going to be offering incentives specific to electrification to move actual projects forward in under-resourced buildings. And that might not be the kind of a funding source that the state has, but that just sort of tier 2 technical support, I think, could be offered by the state to those kinds of under-resourced buildings. The last thing, just while I have the floor, that I might add here is I would really challenge us to think about equity more broadly than sort of this slide implies. We are really focused on delivering benefit to under-resourced communities from our ordinance in terms of energy savings, but also we've seen that in especially affordable housing, 30% of low-income apartment units have carbon monoxide leaks in their gas equipment. So really big health and safety benefits from electrification specifically. And so the way that, like, how are we end up framing all of this from the task force, I would, and this is sort of how our task force thought about it, was let's talk about the benefits we want to deliver those communities. Let's make sure they get those benefits first from the way this is implemented, and provide the support that's necessary for that. One thing I didn't flag, but because I caught it just actually as we went into voting, was that I saw that we have an ability for under-resourced buildings in what we voted on to adjust their target. That's not an option in Denver, just because they're under-resourced. We want to help them meet their targets. We don't want to set lower targets for them. They need the energy savings. They need the quality spaces. And so I would sort of shift the framing and then support and make sure we're supporting them with compliance to this slide.
Thanks so much, Katrina. It's really helpful framing to think about how Denver is putting this together. Any other final thoughts on equity considerations and programs that we might consider from an equity standpoint before we move on to workforce? Joel.
I can't recall to what extent the state is considering grants for compliance, but I think that would be a good thing to leverage, make it a condition of the grant that any costs, remaining costs not covered by the grant, are not passed along to tenants, particularly historically disadvantaged, or at very least cap the amount of additional costs that can be passed on as a condition of the grant.
Thanks, Joel. That's a really good point. Nori.
Sorry, last thing. I do think that I keep harping on the indoor air quality because it is going to be such a great fringe benefit of this program that I see. And there's so many small programs out there that we could use this as a kind of catalyst for the other benefits and grants that are out there, such as here's your free carbon monoxide, here's your radon testing that's free from public health, here's your I don't know, I can't think of them all, but even utility assistance, like payment with your utility bills, if they are going to go up in the short term, and LEAP types of funds. So there's just a lot that people may or may not, they might be turned off by this, but if we bundle it together and really show that once you're in the buildings doing these upgrades, here's some really low hanging fruit that can basically be paid for at the same time, it might be a nice opportunity to do some total makeover above and beyond what we're intending to do with the specific BPS.
Great, great. Yeah, I think that kind of goes hand in hand with the idea of some grants with some specific language as well. So Katrina, you had raised your hand again and then put it back down. Was that just, okay, great. Perfect. So I think we'll move on and just discuss quickly on the workforce side of things. So this is another area, obviously, where we want to ensure that there are programs that will ensure that when the BPS goes into effect, June of 2023, we are supporting the workforce in making sure that they are prepared and ready to be a part of this work. So really, again, looking at, what can we do to make sure that the BPS doesn't disproportionately impact the workforce and especially underrepresented members of the workforce, and then what can be done to engage folks in this work as we move forward. So Karen had an idea in the chat already regarding recruiting workforce from under-resourced buildings, and a great note that we need Jenny here, but she is unfortunately absent. I'm sure she'll be able to share a lot of great ideas in our upcoming meetings as well, though. Paul notes that great point, and you've definitely made that before, Paul, that workforce needs to include the design side, not just construction. So thank you for pointing that out. Any other thoughts on programs to support workforce, or how we can ensure that we have a workforce that is ready to engage in the BPS and help building owners to move this forward?
One thing I can just share quickly related to my experience working on workforce issues up in the mountain communities is that, and correct me, you guys all probably know a little bit more there. From my understanding, there are very limited trade school opportunities within the state of Colorado for folks to go to get the types of training needed to really be that sort of energy efficiency, existing building type trades skill set to get that skill set. And so just a suggestion to think about how we might bring more education specifically focused in those trades and in existing buildings to the state and make those more accessible to folks throughout the state.
Thanks, Kim. Along those lines, Karen's noted that we need to work with vocational high schools. Bill's noting that we need lots of refrigeration technicians to support all of those heat pumps. And the community college system needs to have targeted building operator training available. Lots of great ideas going on in the chat, guys. Feel free to unmute yourselves and share those out loud if you'd like to. Or I can just read them for you, but you might get tired of my voice.
I feel like I keep talking, but I do like the idea of like partnering with local workforce. Right now, it feels like the Boulder County Workforce Agency is having a hard time even recruiting talent to even train because of the shortages within the industry. So starting early seems like a great idea, and really targeting like refrigeration licensing electricians as kind of these core HVAC techs who are going to really need to get in there and figure out what's currently existing and what needs to be improved, or how do you the building commissioning, I think it's called, where you're sort of balancing the building from the engineer's perspective. Those sorts of things would be super valuable, but starting early with those seems like a great idea.
Thanks, Nori. Cecil, please.
Yeah, I just wanted to say, we're obviously in the industry. It's the work we do every day. We have a lot of contractors that are doing that work every day. We're out there, we're in the high schools, we're at the community colleges. We're starting our apprenticeship program is going to be a college. So there's a lot of things going on. We're putting a lot of effort into recruiting workforce. It's not just Colorado that the workforce is short. It's across the country. There's no easy way to get people into the industry. And I think for us in particular, we're out there every day trying to get as many people as we can. New ideas are good, but hopefully there's something that comes up that we haven't already tried. But it's not an easy task at this stage of where we're at.
Yeah. Yeah, thanks for sharing that, Cecil. And I wonder, from your perspective, is there any, what needs to happen? What in an ideal state scenario, like in a perfect world, what do you think would get folks into the workforce and into training and getting these skills that needs to happen, and to the degree that needs to happen?
I think it's a systematic change. It's everyone was told in high school to go anywhere, you got to go to college, right? So I think that's where it starts. I think guidance counselors, I think, a lot of the high school programs need to, not push people that way, but definitely let people know it's an option. Not everyone's suitable to sit in the classroom another 4 years in college. There are other good pathways. And that's what we try to do when we're talking to high school students, is let them know that there is another way to make a living. So, yeah, I don't know of anything new. I think a lot of it has to do with the guidance counselors, the students, and reaching out to the parents of those kids. Because a lot of times obviously parents have a lot of influence on what their kids are going to do. So it's just getting the information out there, I think, is the hard part.
Yeah, absolutely. And I apologize. I have a follow-up question, and I wish I knew the answer to this already, but are there existing programs to ensure, to provide more funding I know that often apprenticeship programs are paid, but is that something where an infusion of funding would be supportive?
Well, our programs are all, we pay for our own programs, right? So our apprentices go to work full time and they pay $200 a year to go to the apprenticeship program. That's the way we work. I'm not sure how the other programs work across the state. Some of the other contractors, I don't know how those apprenticeship programs work. But, it's one of those things. I think you got to keep it fair across the board. I mean, I think if you want to try to get funding into apprenticeship programs, as long as everybody gets funding into apprenticeship programs, I would think that would help a little. But I personally think the big way to get more people into the industry is make it a bigger part of education for not only the students, but the parents.
Okay.
So Julia, just a follow-up on that. So AGC, we have a partnership. So we're kind of the commercial side of construction with and general contractors and specialty contractors. And obviously many of our members work with the pipe fitters, electricians, plumbers, those trades. With the Home Builders Association, we formed a separate company, Careers in Construction Colorado, and we have now inserted a high school construction trades program in 29 different high schools at 20 different school districts. And it takes an immense amount of money from the outside, our private industry, to provide them the curriculum, the instructor training, the equipment, the adjunct faculty, but the high school has to have the space and they have to have the instructor, the CT instructor. We could be at 65 to 70 schools today if we had the funding. We're spending, 50,000 roughly or more per school, $1.2 million budget, but we're limited by the amount of funding we can raise. And we presented to the state legislature a plan to go to 65 schools with some of the COVID money, but they decided to go another route and kind of pitch all the money over to a state department and tell them to figure out how to do the grant program. So in answer to your question, apprenticeship is paid for adults, but we need to increase the pipeline at the high school level. And we're scratching and clawing to do that, but we've run out of money at 30 schools. So we could significantly increase that. We are also building a green building program for high school that we'll host at our campus here, in addition to our 6 craft apprenticeship program. But we're limited, in answering your question, we're limited by funding, and we sought funding from the state and did not receive it because they decided not to write individual bills, but to bundle it into one big grant program. So that's what it's going to take. And then those high school students, if we could grow, we've got 2,000 students now, and we could grow that quite a bit. And many of them would go into apprenticeship program like the pipe fitters. And yes, they have the Western States College of Construction. That's awesome. Get their AA degree and their apprenticeship, but we're limited by funding.
Thanks, Michael. That's really good perspective and information. Any other thoughts on workforce considerations? We're definitely hearing that the pipeline, the educational pipeline to get folks into these careers is limited at best right now. And some of that might be driven by a lack of funding and a lack of financial infrastructure to move people through that pipeline, especially young folks. I won't go back through everything in the chat, but I was keeping an eye on it a little bit while we were also chatting here, and I think there were some interesting comments around. I think Nori, it may have been one of your comments around requirements within contracts for minority and women-owned businesses and things of that nature. So that's something to consider as well.
Judy, just the other thing is if you're a student of demographics, you will quickly become discouraged on this issue. There's going to be a worldwide workforce shortage, a US workforce shortage, a Colorado workforce shortage, and 7, 8 different industries are all going to be competing for the same person, from restaurant to retail to manufacturing to trucking to construction. So part of it is just that anyone who is inclined to kind of work in those kind of industries is going to have a plethora of choices. So the problem is larger than construction. It's a societal issue.
Yeah, I'm not sure we'll fix that through this conversation here today.
I do not think that we will.
But it's useful framing to have, I believe.
Well, I just give that overall. I study that problem every single day for much of the day, and we're working very hard to run in place.
Yeah, absolutely.
We're 10,000 employees behind where we were 3 years ago for the same amount of work.
Paul, I saw you unmute yourself really quickly there. So.
Oh, I was just going to respond quickly to Michael's comment. I noticed in the news yesterday, the birth rate in the U.S. ticked up for the first time this year since 2014. So maybe there's the beginnings of an improvement there in the demographic issue you mentioned. But since you called on me, Julie, add one thing too. We've tended to focus a lot on mechanical, electrical trades, and that's entirely appropriate. But I wanted to mention that there are general envelope aspects of the construction industry, particularly glazing and insulation, that will also have a part to play in this. I think it's important not to think of this as limited to mechanical, electrical.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a really good point. Thanks, Paul. Yeah, and maybe 20 years with this uptick in the birth rate, maybe 20 years from now, we won't be having this problem. But until then, we've got our work cut out for us, I think. I am seeing that it's 3:20 and want to make sure that we have time for closing and next steps. Kim, did you want to take it back over for that?
Sure, I'd be happy to. So thanks everyone for your great thoughts so far on programs and equity and workforce. And we will continue this conversation in the optional meeting we have coming up, and then as well as our next full task force meeting. So as you guys come up with ideas or thoughts in the interim between meetings, please feel free to share those with the Lotus or CEO team, or share those on monday.com for the whole task force to see. And so we really appreciate this great initial brainstorm, and we'll continue to dive deeper into these topics as we move forward. So I just wanted to give you guys a little preview of what's coming. Our next optional meeting is going to be June 8th from 1 to 2 p.m. That's 2 weeks from now. It's a Wednesday. And then our task force meeting number 10 will be June 29th, 1 to 3:30 p.m. We are working right now, the Lotus and CEO team, to finalize the public engagement survey that I mentioned at the beginning of the meeting. And once we have that draft survey, and I'm going to call it a draft for a very good reason, that draft survey ready, we are hoping to share that with the task force and get your guys' input on, are we asking the right types of questions? And so I just want to frame this before, while I have you all here, so it's hopefully easy and clear when you guys get the survey. It will be not all of the questions might be written out, and that is because our team will still need to be integrating some of these proposals that came out of this meeting and some of the demand flexibility stuff that we haven't finalized yet into the survey before we share that out. So our ask when we share the survey with you all is going to be, are we asking the right types of questions? Are there questions missing? You'll see in the survey, we have 3 audiences that will ask, basically 3 subsets of questions that will be specific to 3 different audiences. So we'll have local government questions, we'll have workforce specific questions, and then I'm forgetting the third category. Crystal or Julia, can you save me on this one? There's a third category of questions, and we'll have questions related to that as well. All of that will be made clear when you see the survey, but what we're asking with the survey review is not necessarily for a wordsmith, although if you catch us on a grammar error, please make sure to, we'll be happy to make that update. But really, are we asking the right types of questions to the right audiences across the state? And as Julia said, you guys are really on the front lines of all of this. And so you guys are the ones we're going to look to help us advise what we should be asking in the feedback we should be collecting from the various stakeholder groups. So all to say, that will be coming soon. When it's sent out, it's going to be a short turnaround for review. We're going to probably only, with our timeline that we have left, I'm guessing it will be between 3 to 4 days for work days for you all to review. So I want to put that all in your minds now. So when we have it ready, and we'll try to give you a heads up when it's coming, it should be in the next week or so. You guys have that time mapped out to help us review. Once we get your guys' final review, we'll take all your feedback, we'll finalize the survey, and then we will launch that survey. Once we do that, we will share the survey link with you guys, as well as the final PowerPoint slides. And at that point in time, Nori, to your question earlier, you guys will be able to go out and give that presentation to any of your networks or stakeholders. So I know that's all sort of still vague, but we are working diligently to get all of this done in a really good timeline. So thank you all for your patience with us. And we look forward at our optional meeting, next optional meeting and next task force meeting, to continuing to discuss workforce and equity programs to support compliance. And we'll have some public engagement meeting updates for you guys as well. So that's all from me. And yeah, Julia, sorry, did you have anything to add?
Yeah, so, no, really quick. Stacy had a question in the chat just regarding who we're sending the survey to and how we're selecting who will receive the survey. we do have a list that initially we'll be sending it out to, but this is something as well that we would really love the task force's help on. So if you remember back some time ago, there was a spreadsheet. I don't know why that word escaped me there for a moment. Sorry. There was a spreadsheet that we were asking you to input in where you were doing some public engagements. And then we also have another one that includes information on different outlets that this survey should go to. So that's something that we would love your take on, basically. We'll put that in monday.com when we share the draft survey. And if you could add in information on anyone you think should receive the survey, we would love for you to do that and love to send it out to those folks.
And just to add on to all the great information that Kim and Julia provided, the link will be available to anyone to take the survey. It will be on the Colorado Energy Office's website with the other resources, like the PowerPoint and possibly a one-pager as well. So we hope the task force will circulate it as well, but there will be a main place where anyone could click the survey link and take it. But like Lotus said, we will follow up with all these specifics once we send out the draft.
All right. Well, thank you, Julia. Thank you, Crystal. And thanks, Stacy, for that great question. So with that, we'll go ahead and wrap up the meeting for today. Thank you all for being here and spending your time with us. And we look forward to seeing you at the next optional meeting.